start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
This is Out of Bounds, two guys talking sports and astrology. You're listening to Wayne Moody and Mark Lerner.
Welcome, Brother Wayne Moody. Hello, this is Mark.
Hello, Mark. I'm back. He's back.
Yeah, Brother Wayne was on an amazing trip, and I'm sure everybody will tune into in the next GPS astrology magazine. But let me just introduce for the moment our podcast today, which is 113 of all the podcasts that have ever happened that I'm a part of. And this is about, I think it's the 9th or 10th we've done. We, as I've shared before, we did dozens of these before we came up with the name, and then we decided to launch this last year. So today, this is what we call podcast 113 of the overall podcast. But for this particular one, I want to say the following. It is Saturday, April 1, 2023, and we now offer a new podcast, Out of Bounds, two guys talking sports and astrology, with Wayne Moody and Mark Lerner on the explosion of legal sports betting, with a particular focus on the horoscope of Pete Rose. Born on April 14, 1941, a Sun-sign Aries with Moon in Sagittarius, Pete Rose was banned from Major League Baseball, mainly due to betting on the baseball teams he played on and managed. And he has been prevented from entering the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame, even though he has the most hits by any player and holds many other distinguished baseball records. Pete Rose was born with Pluto exactly stationary at birth, and his horoscope is greatly in sync with the USA horoscope from our Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. Overall, this is podcast number 113 offered to the public since I began starting this in May of 2019. So I want to primarily focus on the chart of Pete Rose, at least for a little bit, and we could go back and forth on that and how that connects up to, for instance, Brother Wayne and I have been sharing in many of these podcasts. We have been sharing with the public, and many other professional astrologers have been saying for the last year or so, the United States Pluto has come back. It never did that before because it has a 247-year cycle. And Pluto, in the chart we have used from Welcome to Planet Earth, that Brother Wayne is using, that I am using, we have Pluto in the second house in the sign Capricorn, which is the house of money. And one other little reference before we go back and forth, and I'll turn it over to you to get going on all this, is that what I wanted to say was 4 days before the Ukraine war began on February 24th of last year, Pluto made its first exact return for the United States at 28 degrees of Capricorn, and then came back 2 more times last year. And it's still coming back, even though we all have heard about, Pluto's gone into Aquarius, which will take quite a bit of time before that actually takes hold, not till the fall of 2024, and then Pluto will be going through Aquarius for 20 years. But meanwhile, in the fall of this year, we still get Pluto coming back within about a third of a degree to its natal position for the United States. So I just mentioned that it turns out, and I've known this for many years because I've watched the whole history of the Hall of Fame, Pete Rose, other players in baseball and other sports, with all of this betting and gambling and so on. The fact that Pete Rose is born exactly on the day of a Pluto station, and for those of you who are listening, if you're born within 2 days or 3 days or even a week of a Pluto station or any planetary station, that's still a stationary body in your chart with all kinds of extra powers. This guy, considering everything we are aware of in his life, and you can read the Wikipedia and other stories, which is a whole sort of history about gambling, sports, baseball, national pastime, different kind of issues across the board, a very unusual life that this person has lived. But one of the big things is that Pluto is motionless. And why don't you bring up a couple of the things that you see in his chart and other kind of directions you want to go, and then we'll go back and forth.
Yes, Mark. Pete Rose has a middle of Aries, 15 degrees rising. And close to his rising sign, he has Mercury and Venus. Mercury is above it at 3 degrees. Venus is below it at 22 degrees. And what's important about all of this fire on his ascendant is how it hooks up to his moon at 0 degrees of Sag and to the Pluto, the aforementioned Pluto that Mark just referenced as having been stationary and therefore extremely significant in the life of this individual. And it's like Jung said about the vintage of a year being the characteristics and quality of that year. Here is a guy who's on fire. And, you know, when you read about his life, about his personal life and his temperament, he was this kind of extremely, he was a Bantam. He was like Napoleon. In high school, he was a small athlete, 150 pounds. He could dunk. And he was very, very aggressive and short with people. Yeah. And so here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, plus his ascendant, 6, and Chiron near his Pluto. This guy. Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, you brought up 15 of Aries, and oddly enough, Chiron is exactly there by transit right now as we're talking, plus his birthday is coming up, and this Out of Bounds will appear in the next GPS Astrology magazine online. Everybody go to greatbearenterprise.com and subscribe so that you can hear what we're sharing and see Brother Wayne's article on Chiron and so many other things, a lot of people talking about Chiron. So I find it amazing. This is, as Wayne and I would share, at what's called an AA chart. This is not an approximate chart. This is not like, somebody rectified 5:45 in a.m. Cincinnati, Ohio, April 14, 1941. Luckily, this is a recorded birth certificate. So the fact that you brought up the middle of Aries, the thing I wanted to bring up was that we could talk about this, and I know I could talk about it for like hours, just this chart, not even connected to the U.S. chart and the whole issue of gambling. But I do want to bring up a couple of things. As you pointed out, so this is this grand trine in fire signs. And he has what we will call an archetypal chart. Any person who's born with Aries rising, which only happens approximately 2 hours, depending on how far north or south you are from the equator, it's about 2 hours in the course of a 24-hour day. Otherwise, you're going to have another sign rising, like Taurus or so on. So generally, when you get into astrology in the beginning, like Brother Wayne and I did, one of the first things is like, okay, what the heck is all this stuff, right? What are these 12 signs? What about sun, moon, and planets, and so on? And the first thing you see is this picture, and it will show on the left side of the chart, which is what is the representation of the ascendant or rising area. They'll put an archetypal chart with Aries, sign number 1, first sign of spring in the northern hemisphere, on house number 1, then Taurus will be on 2. So one of the things, regardless of what anybody feels about Pete Rose, I mean, I just want to be honest, being a New York Yankee fan, Pete Rose was never my favorite player, but he was so unique. He was so unusual. He was so gifted. He was also a switch hitter like Mickey Mantle. So that's the other thing. Is like you had to look at this stuff, and like even though he got into a lot of brawls, he, like you said, very aggressive and so on. But then look at this, as you brought up, when you look at the chart, he's got Sun conjunct Venus. Okay, the planet traditionally of love. Of course, it's in Aries. He's got an asteroid, Pallas Athena, which has to do with knowledge and wisdom and genius, And this guy was fantastic. By the way, his fielding, he played 5 different positions in his career: first base, second, third base. He didn't play shortstop, right field and left field. And his fielding percentages in the outfield, where he won Gold Gloves, are like the highest of any player in the history of the game. I mean, we've got a lot of outfielders. We've got Babe Ruth, Tris Speaker, Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle, and so on. Well, when this guy was playing the outfield, it was like almost flawless, right? So there's so much in the chart, but also gambling is in particular. If we were to say, well, let's look at gambling for any person, tell me if you think I'm reasonably correct. I think this is an accurate statement. The 5th house of a chart tends to be the main house as far as a domicile of risk-taking and gambling. And here we see Pluto very close, not moving on the cusp of the 5th house. And you said, like, Chiron is nearby. If Chiron is on the U.S. Mercury, in the sign Cancer. And he has Vesta, which represents investments, like investing, say, money in what you believe in, and Juno, which is empowerment or disempowerment, that asteroid. And his Juno is exactly trying his rising Venus in another one of these trines. So, and we haven't gotten to things like Neptune and the 3 planets in Taurus. So this guy is like a walk. Well, let me just say this one thing. One last thing. He's like a walking kaleidoscope of almost every area of our life experience. Go ahead. Yes, and Mark, again, to your point, that Leo on the cusp of the 5th, the signature of gambling for all of us. He's got his son, ruler of that house, in the 1st house, conjunct the Venus you just mentioned, conjunct the ascendant. Yeah. So, maybe he just couldn't help himself. All of his instincts had him be fire and take risks and be reckless. I mean, what's in the 5th house is reinforced by what's on the ascendant there. And he went through psychiatric treatment later. He lied to all of his players. He eventually apologized. When the story goes, as much as we can understand, I think this is pretty true. What happened was he admitted, and this goes back to around 1989, which is interesting because just before we began this, folks, you texted me and said, oh, by the way, because Brother Wayne watches a lot of the Mars energy, the U.S. Mars and Gemini. Recently, we just had 3 Mars returns for the United States. The President of the United States has just been indicted. We don't know where that's going to go. President Trump's son is received 3 of those Mars energies. So I know that this is reasonably correct to say this. Very often, Brother Wayne focuses on the Mars returns for our countries and saw that in 1989, which was the kind of damaging year when the whole Rose thing came out, he had originally lied and said, look, I never bet on baseball. That was the first thing. You guys are off course. He had a lawyer and so on and so forth. But what he was talking about was, I have gambled on football, basketball, horse racing, whatever. And it came out later, that he had to admit that he had lied. But it's also interesting that in that year of 1989, you pointed out that Mars, I think, had come back in April or made a return. April, month of his birthday. And that's what got busted, by the way. That's when the stories came out saying that he was gambling. And then and that's the beginning of the baseball season, just like now, okay? And secondly, it was, when I read, at least from the Wikipedia, it took several months, and it was in August in particular, that I believe the ban happened, and I just sent you, because I remember this, that in August of 1989, which is a big year in my own life, that's when Voyager 2 flew by Neptune and took pictures of Neptune. And let's just focus on this, because the cover story that I created back, Aquarius Pisces, 1997, America's Love Affair with Gambling, I might quote about this because of Neptune. If we look at the 6th house, like I said before, this is almost like equivalent of Donald Trump relative to U.S. presidents, where our former president's chart is so in sync. I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying with the U.S. chart from July 4th, 1776, which is why he usurps the headlines for ever since, 2015. He comes down the escalator and so on. Back to Pete Rose, Neptune 25 plus a Virgo. In 1941, we had just entered the war 2 years, I shouldn't say 2 years earlier. We were about to enter the war against Japan later that year, but the World War II had already begun in Europe in 1939. Now we see Neptune in his chart, Pete Rose, 25 plus Virgo, which is exactly the midhaven of the U.S. chart. And we now know the midhaven of the U.S. chart has that same Neptune from 1776 with this other planet called Chaos. And you just brought that up, like he couldn't help himself. And that was something I was going to say to you, is that everything I was reading, when you look at his whole life, because there's issues with not so much drugs, and I never saw much about that, but sexual things, innuendos, tax issues, and the whole thing of this constant lying, not being able to sort of share the truth about, how addicted he was to all this. And eventually he did try and go through some kind of addiction program for feeling compelled to have to do this. So Neptune is greatly involved in this whole story here, as well as Pluto.
Mark, he reminds me of the nature programs that are so common on TV, where they show two mountain goats butting heads, or stags in the woods.
Yes.
It's like on site.
Yeah.
Pete Rose has to be a certain kind of person. And, I remember, during my college and high school sports days, bumping into people like that. Occasionally you meet a character like that. It was like they were so zealous. And, that nickname that he had, because he would walk, even if he was walked, he would run to first base. And he had taught disdain for the older players on the team and in the league. Now imagine this. Imagine that he's such a whippersnapper that he's not respecting the sports heroes of his days. I mean, he was playing amongst Hall of Famers. And here he goes with this
Charlie Hustle, yeah.
I'm better than you guys. I hustle even when I don't have to hustle. That's why I'm so good. And he couldn't turn it off.
And he has a lot of fixity there in the chart. By the way, that elevated Mars in the 11th house in Aquarius is very important. I did a lot of research in the past. I did a whole article on Don Mattingly's power play when Don Mattingly for the Yankees sort of came out of nowhere to have these extraordinary years for the New York Yankees. He eventually had to leave. He's not in the Hall of Fame either, and not because of any controversy. He got a bad back. He was playing for the Yankees for like 9 to 10 years, never got into a World Series. Pete Rose won 2 World Series for that Big Red Machine in 1975 and 1976. My beloved Yankees lost 4 games in a row in 1976 to his Cincinnati Reds, and that was the year after the famous World Series against the Red Sox. With the more people apparently watched the 75 World Series between the Red Sox and Cincinnati Reds than any other World Series. I mean, that was very, very captivating, and Cincinnati won that at Fenway Park in the last game. So Pete Rose won 2 World Championships, and then he won with the Philadelphia Phillies, who, if I'm not mistaken, never had won a World Series. When I was born in 1950, the Yankees beat the Phillies 4 games in a row. Well, 30 years later, Pete Rose, having been traded to Philadelphia, brought Philadelphia their first World Series championship. So, I mean, these are all other things. So the fact that he's not in the Hall, right, because of all this, again, he eventually said, yes, I did gamble, but he has insisted all along in baseball, he only bet on his team, okay? Now, there's one guy who did some kind of biographical thing, and I was reading, and it said he believes that it's possible that Pete Rose didn't always bet for his team. Okay, so this is an issue we could talk about another time. We're going to bring up some other players and other sports, as we sort of focus on the subject. This is really part 1 of a series of stories. But I wanted to just mention another couple of things here. He has Saturn, Jupiter, and Uranus in Taurus. Now, what was happening in 1940 and 41, in Europe, we had the Battle of Britain taking place, okay, in the fall of 1940. And then in the spring of 1941 was when, you and I have talked about this privately, April 14, 1941. This is within 1 month of the whole Sink the Bismarck situation, right? This is when this major ship of Nazi Germany, is the terror of the seas there, and then eventually sinks the British ship, the Hood. I saw that movie in 1960, Sink the Bismarck, and then I'm sure the leader of Nazi Germany, as you and I have talked privately about this, was like, dancing one of his jigs when he learned that the pride of the the British Navy had been sunk, and the Bismarck had done that. But then 5 days later, in May of 41, the Bismarck gets sunk, and what do we get by June 22nd? We get Germany invading the Soviet Union. The whole war changes, which leads to the demise of Nazi Germany, all happening in that spring into the beginning of summer of 1941. Then the U.S. gets involved, due to the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. So when we look at this guy's chart, he's just a baby, right? And like you're saying, Charlie Hustle, all of these patterns in this chart. Neptune currently is opposing his Neptune. He's about to turn 82, which is one of these challenging times in a person's life if you live that long. And next year, he will have a Uranus return when he's 83 to 84. And so he's got a lot of, my hope here is that the reason I wanted to focus on him, and we can now get into some of this other stuff, is that while we've had all kinds of illegal betting, till the cows come home, the whole history of the country, and I wrote about this in one of these features, there were all these lotteries with the American Revolution in order to raise money for the 13 colonies to get our troops, fighting against England back in those days. I remember reading about everybody chipping in, and to sort of like putting money into the kitty, so on in a little community or something, and somebody, in order to raise money so that town could get some clothing and stuff to, for our troops, you know what I mean, to fight against the British, the Redcoats, and things like that. And so the whole idea of the dream of America, that's the other thing in the article I wrote about the founding of California with the California Gold Rush. One of the things about all that, the founding of California in 1850, is that it was the lure of gold that brought millions of people to California. So that's that's very much connected to Neptune on the top of America's birth chart. And here we have Pete Rose being born with Neptune conjunct the U.S. Neptune, so that he was part of that whole compelling thing. Even though he was born in Ohio, had nothing to do with California. He's part of the connection to the birth of the United States and the birth of California, the whole idea of the gold rush.
Let me add this, Mark. Neptune at 25 of Virgo, sitting on the U.S. midheaven, had just returned in the U.S. horoscope. Mm-hmm. The first return of Neptune in U.S. history. And so when you look at these words that are associated with the American culture, like the American dream, the Patriot soldier, the Yankee Doodle, all of this stuff is part of the mythologizing of this new nation state. And in his day, Charlie Hustle from Cincinnati, Ohio, epitomized that grit, that never quit, that if you work hard, you try hard, even if you don't look like the prototypal player, like a Roger Maris or Mickey Mantle, if you don't look like that, you can be a Charlie Hustle, and you can set all the records and thumb your nose at the guys. That was he was that kind of a ball player. And so with Neptune sitting on the U.S. horoscope midheaven, that burst 1989 when it was revealed, when he was thrown out of baseball. And one more thing. I'm looking at that Mars in Aquarius that you had mentioned before, and Aquarius is it's not a steady, predictable kind of expression. When you look at electricity, alternating current and direct current, when you notice that when a lightning bolt hits, you don't feel it until it's grounded. All these ideas about something being unstable and very difficult to control. As I was traveling around the country through 5 states, I was able to follow the grid, and then the solar farms, and then the wind farms, and they are immense. They are huge. Right. They're as big as cities, and they're out in the middle of nowhere. You see them in the middle of the desert all of a sudden. And when you notice that They can't store this. It's got to be moving all the time. Energy in America has to have a place to go to serve.
Right.
And so when Texas created that problem for California a bunch of years back, it was devastating how it impacted the system here in California. And so I'm looking at him and I see that his Mars opposing to Pluto, sextiling to his moon and to his Mercury, that's a kite. And when you look at some of the old-time astrologers who talked about these patterns in the horoscope, anybody who's flown a kite knows that if you don't have the tail adjusted just right, and if the proportions of the kite aren't just right, it won't fly.
Right.
And so I think Charlie Hustle was having this immense psychological issue focusing on staying flying. Anyway.
Well, and the other thing about the Mars, there's so much in the chart because he's got this grand trine, and I do want to mention a comment about this because in a lot of astrology books, it's not, you don't find clients and do charts and it's like, oh wow, there's a nearly exact grand trine. Moon at 0 plus Sagittarius, Mercury 3 plus Aries, Pluto 2 plus Leo. Pluto is at the midpoint of Moon and Mercury. That's the other thing. It's a very tight grand trine. Pluto's near the cusp of the second house. It's not moving. However, everything that you brought up, by the way, when you add Sedna to his chart, which was discovered November of 2003, Sedna is one of these faraway planets. It's the furthest away in our solar system, 11,400-year orbit. And it's kind of a Persephone figure. And we don't know a whole lot about it, but there's a whole myth. It comes from Inuit mythology, Eskimo mythology, and it's really fascinating. But Sedna is a kind of, it's a feminine body. It's considered feminine. But nevertheless, it's a Persephone-type figure in the waters of the earth, okay, in the depths of the oceans. And there's a fantastic kind of issue there of a father-daughter energy and the daughter sort of going down into the depths of the ocean, in the cold depths of the ocean, where she's been isolated and loses touch with the father figure. Maybe this is part of his own life history or ancestry.
It is, Mark, it is.
Well, wait. Okay, he's got it rising. He's got it even closer to his ascendant. Sedna is within 5 degrees, and his Sedna is conjunct Venus, and that's the U.S. Chiron position, by the way, almost precisely. And you brought that up. So the Chiron is on his ascendant by transit. His natal Sedna is rising, which is the U.S. Chiron. Opposite are Juno, which is another Venus-type position of peace and harmony when it works well. But when this is part of the thing today, all these tornadoes, all these storms. By the way, to throw something else out, we're going to have this annular solar eclipse on October 14th. Later this year. We're already going to have one in a couple of weeks that's also big at the 30th Aries, but the one on October 14th is going to be exactly on the United States Juno and opposite our Chiron. One more thing about the Mars, though. See, again, we could get lost in all this amazing, the kites, the trines, and everything else, squares. Mars rules the chart. Mars is the chart ruler in the sign of group dynamics. Well, what was he, like you said, he wanted to show with that running to first base. Nobody else did that. They put the bat down and then they would, trot over there. He was like dashing over there. Hey, I can't wait till I get on a base. Maybe I'll steal the base. Maybe I'll get to second base. And so Mars in Aquarius, which also brings up he's unique. He's a switch hitter. He's relentless. It's a fixed power sign, and it's in the 11th house and the 11th sign. So the thing is that all I know is this is a very interesting point I wanted to bring up. Ty Cobb, he broke Ty Cobb's record. There was only 2 baseball players who have 4,000 or more hits. And when he broke the record, he was in Philadelphia. I'm pretty sure, well, I don't know if he was in Philadelphia or Cincinnati. He might have been in Cincinnati. So let me take that back. He was wherever he was. It was late in the career because it was 4,100 hits. He cried. His son was playing with the team, so I think it was Cincinnati. And he got to first base. He broke the record. They put all the things up there. As I remember, it was in Cincinnati. The owner, Mark, shot came out. He's actually in the Cincinnati Reds Hall of Fame. So this is another thing. Barry Bonds is in the San Francisco Hall of Fame, and he's not going to the Hall of Fame of regular baseball. So maybe this is a states' rights versus like federal government thing, just like with Trump and all these other things. In baseball, look, he wants to be in the Hall of Fame, Major League Baseball, but because of all these puritanical kind of rules, and you got to behave this way and that way, but it's not stopping the Reds. It didn't stop him 7 years ago. He's in the Hall of Fame for, the Cincinnati Reds. By the way, let me just bring up Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays for other issues. I was going to say graduated. When they left baseball, they decided, okay, or I don't know if it was both of them. It happened at the same time. I forget the year. You can find it out on Wikipedia, but I remember when it happened. Both Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle, these two great superstars, came up both in 1951, both the same age, born in 1931, 6 months apart. They ended their careers, and then places in Las Vegas, Caesar's Palace or wherever it was, asked, hey, would you guys sort of be, larger than life representations, to sort of do different things. And I think it was Bowie Kuhn, who was the, in charge of baseball, told them, no, you can't do this. Again, it wasn't like, these guys are in the Hall of Fame. Mickey Mantle, didn't do any kind of betting, that we know of in baseball. So, of games, whatever. But they weren't allowed due to the commissioner of Major League Baseball. And that goes back, decades ago. And I remember when the story came out, it was like, you got to be kidding me. These are superstars. Who's the commissioner of baseball? I'm not saying it was unimportant, but Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle are a lot more national heroes than the commissioner of baseball, who basically, was like slapping on the wrist and said, sorry, guys, we're not going to let you do this. Now, again, they could have fought it, I suppose, but I remember they were each going to get, like $100,000. It wasn't like millions of dollars in those days. They just wanted to earn a living. You know what I mean? And baseball stepped in and said no.
Yeah.
Oh, Lord. Well, you brought up Donald Trump for a second. This is something I wrote near the second half of this article from 26 years ago. This is, again, 1997. This gets us back to New York. The New York State Senate just turned down a casino initiative for upstate New York with a whole lot of fanfare, moralistic crusading during the last week in January 1997. And here's a direct quote, Wayne, from what I wrote. Boy, was Donald Trump pleased. After all, he has hundreds of millions of dollars invested in gambling casinos and hotels in next-door neighbor state New Jersey. He didn't want to lose any of his, quote, financial traffic, unquote. And then I started talking about the rise of the Native American casinos. Do you want to say a word about, you brought up by text chart, you brought up Chris Christie. Do you want to say anything more about that and, what happened there? Because now, with Donald Trump being indicted and going into New York City, it's as if like whatever I wrote 27 years ago, now we have another level of this coming up.
What were you referring to there, Mark?
Oh, you had sent a text or two about what had happened with Atlantic City with Trump and losing the casinos.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the deal is this. The Taj Mahal, which is Donald J. Trump's claim to being the perfect businessman.
Mm-hmm.
It was blown up, 3,000 sticks of dynamite on February 17, 2021. Now that date instant rings bells in my head because
right.
Sun is in Aquarius, and on the U.S. moon, very close, having crossed over it. And so
that's the day that Pluto. Oh, Pluto was discovered on February 18th. So it's the same kind of position. We'll get back to Pluto again. Go ahead.
And so here you have this immense amount of power to bring down this gambling institution, this massive building. Anybody who's been to Atlantic City, like my family, would go there for for vacations from Philadelphia. And this was lowercase DJT's claim to fame for being, I am the Mr. Businessman, and if you want to see success, look at me. And so shortly after the January 6th situation, and we have to call it a situation because in Jersey talk, that's a situation. You know, when you watch their movies about wise guys and all that, that's how they talk. Right. And so we have a situation where the symbol of his greatness and his power comes down a month plus after this situation happened in the capital of the United States, which has seemed to be the turning point of his political power. Anyway, I just thought I'd point that out because it's just such a coincidence that why did they wait so long to tear that building down? And tear it down when he does his greatest act. I guess if it was Shakespeare and he was writing a play for him, this would be, his I don't know, his opus. But I guess he's not finished, and he's gone out and gotten himself another playwright to write up a new story so that he can assume that mantle of authority and power and prestige that he thought he once had. Anyway, changing the subject just 180 degrees, the Supreme Court has a tremendous role to play in the culture of gambling in the United States today. And I hope we can give that a few minutes because what happened what happened in 1992 and then later overturned in 2018 was very significant, and it plays into the politics that we see playing out in so many other issues in America having to do with states' rights, 10th Amendment. You know, the powers that are not directly vested in the federal government rest in the hands of the state. And then every little example or every little situation it can be argued, like what about gambling, and how about prostitution, and how about abortion and all the rest. And now we see this whole thing of all the system of a civil society that's been put into place becoming unraveled if you get hostile states in a confederation of 50 states. So, and it's not a joke because, literally we're seeing, especially for the last bunch of election cycles I've seen or paid attention to, I think you have too, Mark, is they're very proud of these maps of the United States that have blue states and red states. I mean, they go to town with that. Yeah. And nowadays, when you look at, well, what does that mean? What does it mean that Arizona and Nevada, Oklahoma and Arkansas and Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama are all considered red states? It means states' rights issues. Right. Going from whether or not you have a statue in front of your Capitol building that is of a Confederate soldier, or whether or not you are going to have, in Florida's case, you're going to have issues with transgender people going into your bathrooms, or whether Disney World can take a side. I mean, it's total madness now. And when they talk about culture politics, I think the states' rights issue is culture politics. Right. And anybody who's traveled around the country and gone to different sections of the country, you can just see how different the people live. I mean, the land of enchantment, New Mexico, is beautiful. It's right next door to Arizona. And those states couldn't be different. You couldn't find two states different in their politics. It's just amazing. You cross the border, I think it's the Colorado River is one of the borders, and you cross that river, and all of a sudden, it's like different people, different attitudes. I didn't stick around long enough to find out if they're is anything about the language that I could pick up in my ear like I can in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts and in Vermont and in New York, Mr. New Yorker, and next door to you in New Jersey. And then you guys look at us people in Philadelphia and think we talked funny. So
well, get this. Okay, you just opened the door to legal gambling versus illegal gambling. Back to Donald Trump for a second, Atlantic City, the fall of the Taj Mahal, you gave the date out. So the thing is that, let's not get into illegal gambling. I mean, that's the whole history of, bookies, the mafia, so many different things, and whatever else is going on. But the two states, before all the rise of Native American casinos, like almost everywhere now, Nevada, okay, and I believe Pete Rose moved there. So that's where he's been living. And just remember this, folks, October 31, Nevada came into the Union, October 31 on Halloween, 1864. Guess what? Jupiter, 1+ of Sagittarius, which is the moon of Pete Rose. Now, I didn't do this until now. I just pulled out our friend Mark Penfield, Horoscopes of the Western Hemisphere. This is the way Brother Wayne and I do this thing. We're like groping around for books. Just to be honest, like right before we started, you started texting me a whole bunch of stuff. An hour or two before I was texting you stuff. It's like we're sort of like the universe is throwing all these ideas at us. So the reason I bring this up is, get this. We could have a field day here. The sun of Nevada, where Pete Rose is living, 8+ of Scorpio, exactly square to his Mars. By the way, I don't know if you saw this, but he got involved with world wrestling stuff. And I was thinking, before I even knew that, I hadn't read his whole life story. I had been thinking, with what we know about sports and all these, sports that are, at least that we consider bona fide regular sports that are not like weird and like made up, like wrestling when I grew up in the 50s and stuff, we all knew that wrestling was not exactly the same thing as baseball, basketball, football, hockey, and the regular sports. It was something that like wasn't quite exactly, sort of like, is this really on the level, right? So one thing is that I wanted to tell everybody, and I do this when I share other podcasts, I want people to know we have all these different reports that I sell on the website from Matrix Software in the astrology report area. And that's part of why I wanted us to do this. Not that I'm talking about making money, but we have reports like Skylog and Timeline and all these other reports so you can learn about your progressions. And I want to get it. There's two amazing things that I just discovered, which I didn't know before we started this, about Pete Rose's progress chart, which I'll mention in a moment. But back to New Jersey and Nevada. So you brought up, Chris Christie. You brought up Atlantic City. You brought up Donald Trump's Taj Mahal. So a word about this is that the New Jersey came into the Union December 18, 1787. Sun in Sagittarius, again, Mercury in Sagittarius having so much to do with sports. That's the galactic center as well. And the day that New Jersey came into the Union, and you mentioned Chris Christie as a kind of promoter of the sports world, he was the catalyst with the Supreme Court decision, right? I mean, he was part of the energy field to open the door so that New Jersey and other states could keep going. Or
it was his name that was on the lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court. And then he was out of office, and they put the name of the current governor of New Jersey on the court case, which was settled in 2018.
Well, the chart for New Jersey, you see, shows every state is connected to the U.S. in different ways. Like you mentioned earlier, red state, blue states, the cultural thing. But New Jersey is a very unusual chart because the Sagittarius sun, by the way, the date December 18, 1787, when the Wright brothers first powered air flight, that was in 1903 at the same time when the sun was exactly at the galactic center. And the day after the Wright brothers, talk about a gamble, which led to the whole industry of powered flight. Sun conjunct moon conjunct Uranus, a new moon, the morning after their flight. Years ago, even when I was back in New York and I was getting into astrology, I found that there was an exact time for the Kitty Hawk. Actually, it's Kill Devil Hills. It was like an 8-second or 12-second flight. You know what I mean? Changed everything. And the next morning, was a new moon at the galactic center, our not just our solar system home, our Milky Way galaxy home. And this date of New Jersey of December 18, 1787, the sun is on the north node of the moon. And there's a Saturn, Pluto, and Aquarius, Saturn very close to the U.S. moon. And in this chart, Mars is exactly on the United States Mercury, which we know, you and I, is retrograde at 24 plus a Cancer opposite Pluto when the United States came into being. And here we see New Jersey, because you've been talking about Mars, and we talk about athletics and sports, Mars being the key energy of individual sports and heroism and so on. What are the odds that New Jersey would come into the union with Mars exactly on the USA Mercury, also retrograde? I mean, I'm talking like it's an exact hit.
Well, Mark, and going back to Pete Rose's chart, he's got his Chiron at 25 degrees, very close to the U.S. Mercury. And I can't help but think, since this is his trauma, this is his injury, that Mercury in the U.S. chart in Cancer, the great American sport, you have to have a glove, you catch things, you throw things, baseball.
Yeah.
Use a bat, use a bat with your hands. Mercury.
Yeah, and like as George Carlin would say, the goal of baseball, as opposed to football on the gridiron with the field general, the whole goal of baseball is to go home, which is Cancer, to run around the bases with your multifaceted, energies, playing all these positions, right? He has more at-bats than anybody, played more games than anybody, has more hits than anybody. And we don't have him in the Hall because we don't like his, he did all these things as a personality. And the reason I want to bring Ty Cobb up, and there's a lot of stories that maybe he wasn't as bad, but everyone apparently didn't like him, Ty Cobb. So the previous guy who had 4,000 hits in his epic, which was like the dead ball era, Ty Cobb, the interesting thing is the Hall of Fame didn't always exist. They brought it in the 1930s, and there were 8 guys, Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, and a couple other people, Christy Mathewson and some others, all made it like right off the bat. But the thing is that, supposedly Ty Cobb was not exactly liked. I'm pretty sure that most of the Cincinnati Reds loved Pete Rose and Charlie Hustle. I'm not saying they might not have had a fight or two, just like the Yankees had Billy Martin, getting into fights with George Steinbrenner and so on. But this is my final thing. We've got about another 15 minutes to go here or so. So I want to bring up 2 amazing things. I just brought up that people need to learn about their progressions. Do you remember right at the beginning of the year, we did an out of bounds, and as I was looking at the U.S. chart, which I normally wouldn't look at solar arc progressions, which are different than secondary, what we're used to, and many of you might be mostly used to it if you know about progressions, traditionally for hundreds of years we use what are called secondary progressions. It goes back to your month, day, and year of when you're born, and each day after birth is considered a year of your life, and that's what's called secondary progressions. However, people like Noel Teal, bless his soul, he passed away a number of years ago, and some others, in fact, there's a matrix report called Solar Arc Predictions, based on a lot of his work, and he was touting looking at the solar arc progressions for a country, a person, and so on. What are solar arc progressions? You move all the planets in your chart by the arc that the sun has moved. Whereas secondary progressions, you're just moving one day to the next, and however fast each of the planets, sun and moon, are moving, that becomes your progressed chart. But with solar arc progressions, which were not like happening, I'm pretty sure like 200 years ago or 100 years ago, it's more modern. And again, people like Noel Teal really got into this, writing books and articles about this. If you move the sun's distance for every single planet. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is right at the beginning of the year, you and I did a podcast, and I stumbled upon the fact that the United States solar arc Mars this year, the whole year, is moving at 26 plus of Aquarius, which has never happened before, and any kind of solar arc won't happen for another 360 years once it's happening, because that's how long, the sun's journey is around the zodiac. So this part of the reason we're getting things like Donald Trump indictment, the storms, all these issues with Russia, so much about authoritarianism, the splits in the country. Not that we haven't had the last few years, but it's becoming more intense.
Add to that list domestic violence in America spiking the way it is.
And the school shootings and so on. Here's my point. The U.S. doesn't have one celestial body, the moon, at 26 plus Aquarius. It has Pallas Athena, which is justice, knowledge, wisdom, problem solving, and so much more, and this other planet called Quaoar.
Wait, and add to Pallas patterns. It's patterns that happen.
Yeah. Well, and so Mars won't actually hit our moon till August, September exactly. Meanwhile, Mars is now, this is the solar arc Mars for the U.S. chart is what I'm talking about, is entangled with Quaoar, a newly discovered planet from 2002, based on a creation god from a Native American tribe in Los Angeles area. And what did we just have recently? Storms. I keep thinking of the Julio Iglesias storm. It never rains in California. Talk about a joke. You know, that was popular a long time ago.
You know, when I was traveling down the valley, the storms were chasing us.
Yeah.
And when we were going over we were trying to stay ahead of or behind the storms as they were coming in waves. Remember, California got 14 of them. Right.
Well, and to come into Los Angeles, you know, with such intensity. Northern California a little different. You know, we've been hit in Oregon, Washington. Look, the whole country today. There's all these tornadoes are hitting in the Southwest. Tornadoes hit Mississippi last week. By the way, violence and storms is connected to many different planets. One of which is Juno when it's negative. By the way. That's a whole other story. But let me just say this, because if I don't say it, then you're going to all miss on something really important. The reason I'm bringing up the solar arc Mars for the United States, which is really a struggle here, and we're talking about a major baseball player who's been banned and, you know, can't get into the hall and all these other things. If you progress his chart to now, which I did not do until while we're talking, because I'm sitting in front of my computer, I created two progressions. One is a secondary progression, which is the usual one that many people follow. I think I can say that with, you know, I mean, fundamentally, at least when I was getting into astrology 50, 40, 30 years ago, over the course of time, where each day after birth is a year of living. Pete Rose now, about to turn 82, has his progressed sun. Remember, he is a sun in Aries. His sun is at almost exactly 13 degrees of Cancer, which means that over the next, that's the U.S. sun. So here we are talking about this guy, and the progression is there. Now, meanwhile, his Chiron, because we talked about the fact that transiting Chiron is right now on his ascendant, I just mentioned that Sedna, if you put it in his chart, is on the U.S. Chiron, and Chiron is coming back to the United States both this year and next year. That's another thing, happens every 50 years. So guess what? His secondary progressed Chiron is exactly his natal Pluto. You had pointed out that his Chiron's at 25 Cancer, which is about 6-7 degrees from his natal. But by progression, as we are bringing this focus, look, two guys talking sports and astrology. First of all, that has never existed, right? Out of bounds. A lot of the out of bounds stuff is because of the planet Mars, which does it fairly frequently, and more so than many other planets, and is doing it now. So Chiron has progressed to his Pluto exact to 1 minute of arc. 1 minute, not a degree. Here's the other thing. In his solar arc directions, remember solar arc is different. I wanted to point out this other thing. This is just on the moment, and then this is sort of where I wanted to end my part of today, and you could share how you see all this. His solar arc Mars, this is Pete Rose, now is 27 plus of Aries. Well, what is 27 plus of Aries? That's exactly square the United States natal Pluto, which has just come back, right? For the first time ever. So here we see the Mars, which is in Aquarius in his chart, which is kind of the group energy that he emphasized, leading the Reds to 2 world championships. They had previously won in 1940. It's not as if Cincinnati had won all these championships. They lost to the Yankees in 5 games in 1961. They won the World Series in 1940. By the way, something I want to bring up, they were the team that beat the White Sox, a.k.a. the Black Sox, of the scandal of 1919. Okay, after World War II, the whole scandal of these players like Shoeless Joe Jackson and so on, there's a whole bunch of astrology with that. And Cincinnati, in those days, they played 9 games to see who would win the World Series. And Cincinnati was not favored. The White Sox were favored, but those players, these 8 players, they eventually did the movie Eight Men Out, and then Field of Dreams and other kind of movies based on what became known as the Black Sox scandal. And this is what led to this Judge Landis becoming first baseball commissioner. And these players eventually, the following year, even though they admitted that they had taken, bribes and so on to lose games and so on. But Cincinnati was the team that won that World Series. Cincinnati won in 1940, the year before Pete Rose was born, a few months before he was born. Then they played the Yankees in 61 and lost. And then because of him being on the team, they won 2 world championships in the middle of 1970s. By the way, to bring all that up, so his Mars in his solar arc is squaring the United States Pluto as Pluto has come back. I think that's significant. And the last thing to say, to bring it to today, was that the Reds beat the Pirates today, okay? I think they lost the first game of the baseball season, and I saw they won at home against the Pittsburgh Pirates. So Pete Rose today, if you're betting Pete in Las Vegas, you probably did bet on Cincinnati, and it's okay. You can do all the betting you want because you're not in a part of Major League Baseball, and he's in the capital of gambling in Las Vegas.
Yeah. Well, Mark, let me segue off of what you just said. Gambling. When I was traveling, I was like 30 miles from Las Vegas. I should have dropped in and said hello to Pete. But here's what my final words before in the waning minutes of our GPS. The gambling culture in the United States, you can see how readily and how viral before computers, before the word became a term in computer culture, how viral ideas about good and bad and what's important in America got around through the sports culture, through baseball. You mentioned Black Sox, excuse me. And so when you look at how many Americans, the average American who knew about this scandal, I mean, it was like water. It could go everywhere. It would find its level in all places. So that's my concern about the legalized gambling that the states have elected to do
right
now. Because what happens when you have, for example, this story of Donald Trump indictment odds in February? That was February. It's April. Yeah. In February, the odds makers gave the former president 170 odds to be indicted this year. That's an implied 63% chance. And after yesterday's explosive testimony by a former staffer, odds makers have improved Trump's odds of avoiding indictment. He's now given minus 350 odds, or an implied 77.8% chance to avoid indictment. Okay, we know what just recently happened. So I guess the bookies lost money on that. But you're a numbers cruncher, Mark, and so I leave that with you to make the final comment on the fact that we're in a gambling culture in most states. I can't go into any store in my area without seeing the lottery machines.
All right.
Store, whether it be the Smart and Final, whether it be the drugstore, whether it be next to my bank, whether it be to get my taxes done. They have those machines as ubiquitous as the public telephone used to be. Go find a public telephone nowadays. So the fact that gambling is considered normal, just like when the Dred Scott decision went before the Supreme Court and slavery was considered normal, that people don't even bat an eye when they think about the consequences to the culture that is elected to do this. Because one of the things I was doing while I was waiting for this time slot to do this GPS was I was looking up what are the problems, what are people finding is the consequence of allowing gambling to be legal. And it is when you go to the state of New Jersey and you look at what are they saying in New Jersey, they have all these social programs that have been set up because the epidemic of underage gambling and addictive gambling and people whose lives have been ruined and consequences to family and the safety net that has to be put into place. It's intense. And so here's the state that is behind the lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court that gave the states the rights to choose to have legal gambling or not. And in the very place where it spawned, Chris Christie's state, Christie, and he was the governor who was promoting it and trying to get the federal government off of the backs of states so the states could do what they thought was appropriate in their own best interest. His very state is like in a quagmire of gambling addiction. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I so appreciate that we're able to do this, and due to our wanting to sort of bring it together and not do 2 hours as we would want to do almost 3 hours. I decided, though, let me just, so that this final thing I'm going to say is coming from the article I wrote 26 years ago, and I just want to mention it because I think it will allow us, if I just read this out, so when we do the next one, we want to talk about the reserve clause in baseball and free agency with Curt Flood, famous player. We were texting each other about this. Of course, Jackie Robinson, breaking the color line, particularly back in the middle of April of 1947, another significant year in the United States when when President Truman, we had the whole change in terms of our defense department. I mean, we had a Department of War, then we had a Department of Defense, and this is also connected to UFOs and so on. So a lot of things happened in 1947. But what I want to do is, let me just read this one thing, because this is stuff you and I talk about a whole lot, and if I can read this, then I won't have to read it again for the next time. So bear with me, everybody, but this is based on the fact that Brother Wayne and I have done dozens of these privately, and now this is about the 10th time, and hopefully then the next time we can talk about people like Curt Flood and also bring it out into other sports. I want to talk about like the advertising in the future, like all these players now wearing all these, sports, it's not just sports, like Budweiser beer and on, like on their caps, particularly like in racing and stuff. And I think it's happening now with soccer or, European football. Like players are just like, sort of connected to all these, to make all this money, to being like on their jerseys is what I'm saying. So that's another level of all this. It's not necessarily illegal, but it's sort of like individuals connected. And one other little point, this is sort of an introduction to what I want to say here at the end. I feel really upset that we only have like a Yankee Stadium and a Fenway Park and a Wrigley Field. All these other, this will be another thing we can talk about. Bank One Stadium, the park in San Francisco was AT&T, then it's something else. You know what I mean? These mega conglomerates that like, I want to have our name on the park in San Francisco. And the day that Yankee Stadium is no longer Yankee Stadium or Fenway Park, I mean, what are the people in New York City going to say? You know what I mean? Or the people in Boston or Chicago, Wrigley Field is no longer Wrigley Field? Are you kidding me? You know what I mean? So we're losing the national pastime here. And this gets back to your point about individual states and the whole thing with the former president also. States' rights, federal rights, and what's happening in countries. So let me just read this other thing. And at least I got that idea out because it's stuff that I know that you just were sharing, about the Supreme Court in New Jersey. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be talking about that today. So let me just say this thing. And if you want, we'll have, 5 more minutes or so. So I'm going to say this, and then please make a comment about what I'm saying, okay? So in the article, I wrote that fundamentally America is a dream country created by risk takers and gamblers for well over 200 years. The people searching for religious freedom in the 1600s and 1700s who fled here from tyranny in Europe and Great Britain were following their dream and gambling their lives and their children's lives that somehow life in the new world of America would be their salvation. The entire preparation for and experience of the American Revolution can be seen on a certain level as a bold, daring, and vast game of chance, an ultimate crap game perpetrated by the mob and underworld of the American Freemasons, with notorious names like Franklin, Jefferson, Hamilton, Hancock, Adams, Revere, and Washington. Certainly to the English, our American heroes and forefathers were seen as renegades who needed to be taught a good lesson and ultimately eliminated. It was President Thomas Jefferson in 1803 who gambled that buying the Louisiana Territory, doubling the size of America at that time, for a colossal $15 million from France would somehow be in the best interest of our nation in the future. And it was Secretary of State William Seward, and you and I have talked about this a lot, who purchased Alaska from the Russian Tsar on March 30th, by the way, March 30th, that's just like 2 days ago, anniversary, 1867, for the outrageous at that time sum of $7.2 million. This shocking acquisition of frozen land to the extreme northwest was quickly labeled Seward's folly and Seward's icebox. Nevertheless, in retrospect, it is now seen as one of the greatest financial investments, read gambles, in U.S. history. One more little part of the paragraph here. And you should refamiliarize yourself with our old Wild West, filled with card games, double dealing, gambling parlors, riverboat gambling, and the like for decades. And again, this is that point about California. The California gold rush, beginning secretly on January 24th, 1848, at Sutter's Mill, brought thousands of prospectors, read again gamblers, from the East Coast to the rough terrain of California. In the 7 years from 1849 to 1856, during which California became a state in 1850, the population of California grew from 15,000 to 300,000. And this wasn't just for the warm weather and sunshine. It was because of the lure of gold in them thar hills. And let's not forget gold strikes in the Kansas Territory, Colorado region in 1858, the Comstock silver and gold finds starting in 1859, eventually leading to a minimum of $145 million in gains for prospectors and investors. And then there was the Klondike Gold Rush, 1896 and 1897, near the Canadian-Alaskan border. My final point here was that my point in all this is that we are a nation of gamblers, game players, and risk takers. So that was from the beginning there. And I know this strikes multiple chords for you. So why don't you end with a few minutes of comment, because I know that brings up a lot. I've said all I need to say for today, and I appreciate so much that we're having this discussion.
Mark, if you don't have a mirror to look in, I'll be your mirror here. That was an excellent demonstration of journalistic vision. And that's what we astrologers who write are attempting to do with the messaging that we put out to the public. Journalistic vision, trying to emulate the greatest of those visionaries, Nostradamus. Now,
right.
Get to what you just said about those gold rushes. The United States midheaven relocated to California cities and lands where the gold was discovered is 6 degrees of Leo, early Leo, and that's where
right.
the North Node is. When you go further west towards the Canadian-U.S. border and British Columbia and Vancouver Island, that region, the Alaskan Panhandle, where the gold was discovered, that is getting closer and closer to the U.S. Pluto nadir.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get to Seward, Alaska, or Valdez, Alaska, or Prince or Prudhoe Bay, Alaska, that is the U.S. Sun midheaven. And so, this, you know, the sun is the quintessential symbol for gold, and Pluto and the nadir is mining.
Right.
And the western coast of the United States has been famous for the fact that it was developed because of, first, the mineral wealth that was found, and then the water rights that were found to be so important, and then the Imperial Valley, which I just traveled through. And when you travel hours and hours and hours and see orchards and orchards and stockyards and vineyards and all the rest, it is mind-blowing how wealthy the state is. And so, you know, just to get back to the summary that you just did in a few sentences, to say that 10 years, 20 years in advance of events, that's the journalistic vision that we are trying, I think, collectively to do for our listeners and for those who read us, for our readers, is to give them that gestalt into the future, because that's what our government, I think, right now is sorely lacking. Leaders, people who have that ability to do that. It all seems to be a focused special interest or one topic candidacy to get somebody elected, and to have a bunch of people who are going to sit down and who are seniors or elders, I don't care how old they are, but if they happen to be seniors with children and grandchildren in the world, then how they could make some of the policy decisions that they make without exercising that visionary muscle is beyond me. And that's my close to what I think has been a very good, very entertaining GPS hour.
Well, I so appreciate, you know, and at least we know where we ended here, so we've got a lot we can go in the future. And I'm just going to put one more exclamation to what you were just saying, if this is okay, that you just visited, you went through the Southwest. Everybody should, when you read the next GPS astrology, this podcast will be in there. It'll also be on YouTube. It'll also be on Astroscope, Mark Lerner Astrology Radio at GreatBearEnterprise.com. But with other thing that I just did the other day, which gets back to good old Pete Rose here for 1 second. We've been talking about so much in this chart. His sun is at 24 plus of Aries. And one of the things I just wrote about, because I just finished doing the April cosmic calendar. So this is what I've done for 40 plus years, the astrology cosmic calendar with a K, and you can all get it free 1 day at a time or pennies a day by subscription, is that his sun is 24, this is Pete Rose again, 24 plus of Aries. And Jupiter, for the first time in 12 years, is not only going to hit that in April, around April 23rd, 24th, but Eris, this other planet, like I said, Eris has a 559-year cycle, moves very slowly in our solar system, discovered a little bit after Sedna, January of 2005. And Eris is just basically sitting at this spot. So again, Brother Wayne and I have never talked about Pete Rose together. You know, I've looked at I'd never even looked at his chart before. Okay, before we decided recently, it was my decision. Hey, let's use him, gambling, Major League Baseball, see where this wants to go. And like you just said, I think we've opened the door to something that's really significant. We'll keep going on with this. But Jupiter and Eris together, for the first time in 12 years, the sun, the place that they're going to focus on in a couple of weeks is exactly Pete Rose's sun. So, you can't make this up, right? Brother Wayne,
hey, the gamblers have lost big time with the March Madness, because the front runners, the top seeded teams, are not in the final. They're not in the quarterfinals, and they've got all of these guys who are like Pete Rose types hustling to get the title.
Well, and also with the women's group, that the favorites lost there, and I saw about this gal named Caitlin Collins, I guess it is, for
Yeah.
Iowa, the Hawkeyes, and that she's scoring all these points, and everybody's going crazy over there. And then I don't know if they're going to play like LSU, and LSU beat the other team. And so, again, it's like, as you and I, part of the reason we created all this is somehow or another, what Brother Wayne and I find, we found it separately, now we're finding it together, is that sports is this it's this other energy, and that whenever something is happening, particularly geopolitically, culturally, socially, or whatever, one of these sports, persons or series of persons, or March Madness, whatever it is, will somehow or another, through the gods and goddesses and the astrology cycles, is like, boom, right? Because we all love, we want to have our exercise. We're all walking. We can't be couch potatoes. Everything can't be like the big screen TV. So, we want to be active at the same time. There are different ways to participate. Not everybody can be a Pete Rose or a Willie Mays, or whoever it is in sports, right? So there are both heroes and our teams. And it's not just us, it's the whole planet. Thank God we have it, because if we didn't have that, we would already be on to World War 27? Not 3. I mean, or we wouldn't be here anymore.
That's not funny, Mark. That's not funny.
I know. No, but I'm saying,
I know.
We could go on here, but another topic we could bring up, and we're going to end here in a moment, is like the Olympics coming back in 1896. You know what I mean? After not having the Olympics except for ancient times. And then that's a good idea, and then we even have political things in the history of the Olympics. You just can go into that. So maybe we'll do that as another topic. But we do need to have these sports. And you said it to me more than many times, about the need for all this to happen. Unfortunately, there's violence in sports and there's violence outside of it. But, human beings have to have this competition. And if we could learn how to sort of control it more, we wouldn't have World War I, World War II, or all these other battles, civil wars, and everything else. So I do think that, sports and, sort of martial activities and sports in both, group and team sports and interplanetary, or not interplanetary, but international sports, help us to keep the earth reasonably sane, even though at times it goes overboard. So thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Brother Wayne. Love and blessings to everybody. Go to GPS Astrology for this, to hear this, and YouTube as well, or Astroscope. And we'll be back with another episode sometime soon and continue with what we're sharing. Thanks again, Brother Wayne, for sharing with me, and for everybody out there listening.
Okay, until the next time.
Okay, bye for now.